Thank you very much to all of our speakers. I like how King has adjusted and incorporated some things from our conversations. So we're just gonna set up some chairs here and invite our speakers up on stage. I have one or two little questions I'll throw at them, and then I hope that other people in the audience who have some queries or questions that they would like to ask regarding our speakers or our topic, then we would invite you to do that. So just thank you. Hold on. This feels very official.
These are really comfortable. I'm sorry you didn't get these.
I guess I wanted, in doing this workshop and organizing this M+ matters, I think hopefully it's obvious to the audience that I was trying to put together people with different disciplines and backgrounds. I mean, this was part of the idea to maybe move, to sort of merge the different disciplines of design and architecture and also visual art and things inside the museum, outside the museum. And in doing that, we might reach or be able to have some kind of conversations about the sort of nature of categorization. And I just, as a sort of general question, maybe I'd have everybody say a few words about this. I mean, our topic has been about documentation and art, and I think it came really out of this notion that, not that long ago, we always thought of, documentary or something that, a document as somehow representing truth or reality, and this was always placed in a kind of opposition from art, or as some sort of sort of art's alter ego, in a way that this is how we could know what art was because we could define it against something that wasn't art. But I think this is changing, and I'd like to hear maybe from the different speakers, if they want to share something about why do you think this is changing? What are the things that are maybe happening in our world or in the particular organizations or institutions that you're in that have maybe engendered these kinds of shifts or changes or sort of these erosions of these disciplines? Like, I'm curious to know if there's, maybe each of you can say something. This is something we've sort of touched on in the last, 2 days of conversation. I don't want to take up too much time talking because we've already had a lot of time amongst ourselves, but I thought maybe everyone could sort of say something from their different position about that sort of, the nature of that erosion and where that might be coming from, where it might be heading. Who wants to start?
Well, I think this sort of blurring of the line between art and document has been going on actually for quite a long time. Photography is probably the classic example. Objects that were once considered photographs in an archive or a library have suddenly been discovered to be works of art. Atget is the French photographer who primarily photographed at the turn of the century, and he was photographing in a very documentary way, capturing details of the kind of disappearing Paris urban architecture and the urban landscape. Suddenly could be understood because he was influential on the Surrealists and others, that his photographs might not just be in the service of as documents, and a number of museums started acquiring them for their collection proper rather than for their archive collection. So this, I think, goes back, at least a century even, where the kind of blurry nature of the field has been shifting.
Well, I think a lot of the key terms, these key pillars that kind of held up what was the kind of exalted view of the canonistic view of art that needed to be interrogated. It needed to break down because it was too exclusive. It was too prejudiced against new participation. Certainly in terms of voices that were important, but deemed somehow not proper to art. There's no way within the framework of high art for a very long time in terms of how you accommodate different perspectives and so on, especially outside of the European orbit and so on. So that it needed to do that, right? It needed to break down all these terms, right? But now we've gotten to the point whereby, where we need to kind of recover some of that as well, because it's like Nietzsche's famous line about everything is interpretation, right? So even the documentary form, all those things, all that needs to be broken down as well. And so I think even though that came out of a need, an exigency to break down those terms, I think it was a case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And we now kind of discover in the last, I would say, certainly in the last 15 years, all these new voices coming from different parts of the world that never really had a serious voice, empowerment, a voice given to them. And they're making kind of incredible art in respect to offering quite amazing insights into the condition of everyday life through art, right? Not through necessarily documentary form and so on, but through art. And so I think we're in a very kind of interesting point now, and so on. Just one last point. I do find it a little bit funny that M+ is a new museum. It's in formation, and yet it's kind of vexed to a degree by the kind of burden of the history of museums that should be the purview of the V&A and the National Gallery and things like this. So I find it a little bit funny on that level, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, the history of museums is like for museums that have a history, maybe you can be free. I think it's a bit different if you're an architecture and design curator. I think, I don't know anything about art. My interest is in architecture and design. I think inevitably if you collect an architectural drawing, it points to the building, it is not the building. Like it clearly is referential, and it's always been problematic, displaying architecture for that reason. I think you hit on a kind of powerful question, perhaps not so much in relation to the gun that I showed. I mean, I think the gun is a powerful, technically proficient work of industrial design with the most cutting edge of tools you can imagine. But some of the other objects that we're considering, like I mentioned at the weekend, this pair of jeans that we're acquiring for the collection that was made that just cost £12 from a major retailer in the UK, and they were made in the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh that collapsed in April this year, killing over 1,000 people. And clearly, the accusation has been raised internally. The reason you want those jeans is to point to that event, not because the jeans themselves have any inherent merit as a piece of fashion design. We have a fashion collection, or because they have anything particularly distinctive about them. And I don't know the answer to that right now. I think the way that I'm trying to collect is precisely to pose or to push to the very limit of that question. But I think there is a moment where you go beyond, where you're just collecting signposts, and then then you might as well be a website. There's something, if you're just links, you're a website. I think there is something in the things themselves. I think there is something that changes bodily, physically, about being next to those jeans, about handling them and knowing where they're from and being told where they're from by people who you can trust. That's a different experience. So yeah, somehow we're pushing that boundary too.
Maybe I just refer to your Martian exhibition. If I were a Martian, I would collect everything from Earth and bring it back to Mars to do an exhibition there. The point is how to understand this kind of different artifacts from Earth, right? So CMP has the examples that I just showed illustrate some of our thinking about how to pick up any objects and then try to build some stories or visual stories or even some kind of cultural dimensions to it. So this is our Martians' approach to this kind of street objects. So if a museum could do that, I think if a museum could do that to a painting or to a sculpture or to a glass work, I'm sure a museum with some kind of vision could do something with a trolley like this, or even this water bottle, or this table, or whatever, right? So maybe we should ask the audience, if you were the Martian, whether or not you will collect those things.
Well, actually, there was a very important book on this very topic of Martians collecting things. It was actually by the intellectual Harvard professor Stephen Greenblatt. It was called Marvelous Possessions. It was about the voyage of Christopher Columbus, and they had this problem in terms of things that were floating by the sea as they were getting closer to Hispaniola. And they saw these things, flotsam and all kinds of stuff, kind of floating by the sea, and they're trying to figure out what they meant, right? And then when they landed in the New World, they had to look at, they found natives, and they saw tattoos, and they saw different objects and so on. And then they had to try to make sense of all this stuff, like Martians in a way, right? But they were almost always wrong because they could only interpret the things that they discovered according to the forms and things that they were familiar with, right? So they would say, well, this tattoo, it has to stand for this, when it had no relationship to that. It only stood for that in terms of, it may look like a kind of an arrow to someone from the West, but it actually didn't stand for an arrow. It stood for something else. And so that's the kind of, liability that I would caution against in terms of using King's kind of notion of the Martian.
Yeah, I just want to say, to kind of comment on what you were saying about M+. I mean, I think what's interesting or fascinating to me about this topic is the fact that exactly that that there are these, that we don't look at objects necessarily anymore as just these autonomous things. We are, thinking of how to, this is M+, but I think in many institutions today, part of the reason why we see more documentation or effort to have a story is to sort of enrich what it is that people are seeing or encountering as the material sort of object. So, it is true that maybe we presume the audiences won't be able or be so satisfied just to have that thing there and not have maybe some kind of backstory. I mean, I think that now we can, in some cases, provide these backstories, so then we're able to do that, and that adds more to the experience. It also maybe activates that object in some new way by putting it in a relationship with other things. But it is also a question of how far does one go? I mean, like you were saying with Ken, like how can we just collect everything in the world? I mean, I kept thinking, Kieran, when you're talking about V&A, about just sort of the numbers that you're throwing out and all of it becomes an overwhelming task. And is it not then also the job and task of museums to be editing and using a sort of some kind of filter and lens in doing that? It can't be everything in the world, and it can't be totally
but it's not a zero-sum game, right? So it's not like either everything in the world or just high art. Like it can't. Of course, it's not that. I mean, I had an interesting conversation in the museum recently. We have a Korean curator in our Asia department, and that Korean curator is sponsored by Samsung. So Samsung is the Samsung Korean curator of Korean art and design. And I said to her, have we got Samsung's Galaxy S3 phone in the collection? She said, no, I've got one. I use one. I have to use one. I'm like the Samsung Curator. But it's not in the collection because she's an architect, and so she's not interested in consumer electronics, and she collects architecture and ceramics and things like that. And I thought, this is completely weird. Surely the burden on the V&A is to justify why not the phone and why the ceramics rather than the other way around. Because surely most of our common understanding of design would be more likely to be through that phone than it would be through this very fine piece of contemporary ceramics production. So, but that's not to say that I think that, yeah, every single, as I said over the weekend, every single crisp packet that's thrown away by somebody interesting is something worth collecting. Of course there's judgment, but the extent to which I mean, I'm really sympathetic with a lot of the things that King is pointing to, because these are taboos in terms of taste, and they are still taboos in terms of high and low culture in the institution. I think we're all sympathetic with that. I don't think you have to have all of it. Of course not. You have, as King does, you select the richest stories that tell the story you want to tell. And I think, for me, the value of King's work is in unveiling the layers of richness in a city as rich as Hong Kong, which is kind of a really extraordinary achievement, I think.
Is there someone had a question that they wanted to ask? Can we get a microphone for her?
Thank you. Actually, I'm just trying to make an observation because I enjoy the Martian exhibition documentation and also Silking Chung's report on the community museum project. Because my observation is quite straightforward, and I think, I'm sure a lot of you may have already got that conclusion. That is, the question here is about documentation and art. There's some confusion or some blur boundary between artwork and documentation. But as far as I heard today, I think actually there is underpinning that documentation actually defines artwork. Like if for the marginal wisdom, if there's no documentation, there's no one saying that there's art quality or artistic quality in those objects that you see, you document. And for the Martian, obviously, if there's no, the fictitious documentation about the artwork, then you would not be able to tell a story about the art. So I think that is, there's something that I think has to say out loud. That it's, yes, in a lot of museums, first there is artwork before that somebody will put together some documentation about the art piece. But actually, I think, that could be the other way around, that it should be documentation first, and documentation can define what is art. That's it, thank you.
I think it would be hard to start with the documentation first. It's, there's all kinds of debates about what constitutes the work of art, and it has to come from some other place before documentation. Yes, there's stories attached to works of art, and those stories might change over time. We can't control the interpretation and reception of works in 100 years' time, for example, way beyond the life of the author of the work. Yeah, the notion that somehow the documentation can precede the work is very strange, and work may not ever be documented, and that's fine as well. Could be just something that happens in a moment and disappears again.
I think it's like a discursive trap that M+ may be finding itself in. On the one hand, it's a kind of an art museum, but it's not really an art museum. It's visual culture, right? And visual culture emerged out of as a counterpoint to art, right? So it has to be everything that art isn't in a way, and yet at the same time, paradoxically, it has to incorporate all of art, because art is also becomes a subset of visual culture, right? And then you also have this kind of problem in terms of that the entire semantic, semiotic field should be open for the museum to pick out things so that we can have a better, deeper understanding of society, and which is, I guess, more King's view, which I agree with. I think all of that should be availed, right? That way, it challenges museums when they start collecting and so on, in terms of being on guard for all kinds of decisions predicated on taste and whatever, so that they're always thinking twice in terms of how they construct these narratives and so on. So you have this discursive trap, and it's a kind of a problem. But I would respond this way, which is that do you still believe in art, right? Do you still believe in? I'm speaking in third person. Do you still believe in the idea that an artist can actually has value and a special capacity to draw out and distill significations out there over and above the kind of continuum called visual culture? I happen to believe that. So I don't have so much of a problem in terms of this discursive trap.
I somewhat agree with you, but I don't know that it means that talking about or that saying visual culture then is not somehow the same as saying art, or that one has to. I'm not sure. I agree with you on some level, but I think there's more room to encompass all of these things. I don't think they have to. One has to. The presence of one negates the presence of another. Yeah.
I'm not saying it negates, but I'm saying that there is this debate within academia, at least, because I'm a product of academia, which is that that art doesn't encompass the world enough. And that's actually true. If you start looking at museums of modern art and contemporary art, and you start looking at, and then you just take take the subway or take the Star Ferry, you kind of realize the kind of surfeit of richness that encompasses an experience, right? Which is like this. All the possible subject matter on any given moment is like this. But then you go to an art museum, and the totality of the art that's talking about this is about that wide, right? Generally, right? It's getting wider all the time, so that's good. And so visual culture kind of emerged out of this kind of dissatisfaction of art, right? And they were actually correct, because they said, well, art is also a problem because it's elitist, it's patriarchal, it's too much given over to commodity culture, the art market, and also all those things. And they were right? But where they were wrong was that, and I guess it's just maybe not wrong, a disagreement would be from, at least from my point of view, is that they also didn't believe in the artist anymore. They also didn't believe in the capacity of art to draw out things at a deeper level from the kind of visual culture, right? So that's a kind of debate that's ongoing today.
Can I add something to that? I mean, for me, maybe that is a kind of, because I see exactly where you're coming from, but I suppose in response to the possible kind of, let's chop it up by words kind of attitude that somehow exhibits, and I think you're pointing to, I think an institution has to find another motivation, like another impetus, another momentum from somewhere else. And one of the things I didn't talk about in this evening, but we've discussed a bit over the weekend, is the idea, for instance, I think in my fields of architecture, design, and digital design, they're most interesting right now when they bear on how you and I live together as citizens. And they're least interesting when they're about, what do I want to buy for my house? So my overall, they're more interesting when they're about the public. And so my overall driving kind of momentum comes from an interest in public life, and how does design and architecture articulate and describe and sometimes limit the possibilities and sometimes liberate the possibilities for public life. Now, I would say that sort of gets over the semantic hurdle, right? Because it's a civic sort of momentum. It's a different kind of thing. And you'll find every institution or every body finds their own, don't they? You don't have to be the whole universe and then justify why the whole universe is or isn't in your, or bits of the universe is or isn't in your collection.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, we have one in the back here.
Hi. I guess it's more a combination of comments and also a small question. But it somehow feels like a steering committee suddenly for M+'s strategy, which is quite interesting to me because I think this whole question about documentation, I feel like M+ has a great role to play right now to set an example or also to play a significant part in how documentation could question how we can perceive truths and also artwork in the traditional sense of the art in the purest form without documentation. Almost the way in which we've been speaking, it feels like documentation can pollute an artwork or the artwork itself, that process of creativity. And I think what was just said about the motivation is very important because, for example, as an artist, if you go to my website, it's more like an archive of all the projects I've ever done. And it's more as, I'm not particularly bothered that it's a challenge for people to navigate my art site to find and make sense of my projects because it's more like a holistic narrative that's part of my process. And in this sense, I think that, documentation itself can be quite a political weapon. So, for example, I might create a performance, and that video of that performance itself has been shown in a gallery. So for me, this isn't a problematic. It's driven by, the necessity of the message having its medium. And in this sense, then perhaps M+ could see how when the documentation is necessary, then it will support or become embedded within the story of that art piece.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. I think I hope we're not giving the impression that that we are trying to instill more hierarchies. I think, in fact, we're trying to sort of show how these are shifting and maybe even being undermined constantly, and that what we would imagine happening in M+ is exactly that, like a kind of. I think what we're looking at or thinking about is and realizing is that we are building a museum in a moment now where these categories are shifting and moving, and we're wondering also where they're heading, but that we recognize that what we plan to do in M+ will very much probably put documentation, documentary forms together with artworks in some cases, that this is part of a way of narrating certain kinds of stories, and there will maybe have a kind of this kind of mixture of different types of works that traditionally before had very strict hierarchies, but maybe we'll be able to do something that can shift those hierarchies a little bit, or at least I don't think we want to instill them more. I was talking to one of the workshop participants today, actually, and then she had to leave, so she's not part of this panel or this group. But we were talking about how one can understand artists' practice or even designers or creators, how certain practices are, how they evolve and how they play out across different media. And so it may be that it's through a book, or it may be that it's through they designed a poster, or that at some point they made a performance and there's a film of that, and so one can not have to necessarily put everything in those strict boxes, but that we can actually mix up those categories and look at how certain sort of practices sort of unfold across different media, and that might encompass different time periods, and then eventually it does sort of maybe paint a picture of artistic practice that is like embedded in particular time and place and with the sort of social political circumstances around it, and that all these things are part of that story. Together. Is there, okay, Ken has one more comment, and then I have to take another question.
I just want to say that, documentation is only a problem if you take the view that, everything is worthy of documentation, if everything in the visual field is worthy of being documented, then I would say that's a kind of a challenge. Okay, that would be a kind of a problem. But that's where, you see, this is where I'm in profound agreement with King, right? He's not documenting everything. He knows that there's tons of stuff out there, but he's targeting certain things that are particular to Hong Kong, right? And he's theorizing it. It's not that there aren't trolleys in London or wherever else, but there's a particular Hong Kong trolley, or there's a particular kind of attitude towards material, right? And that's very hard to kind of distill, but he's doing that, right, through his methodology. And so yes, if you take the entire visual field and say, well, we need to, as constituting visual culture, we need to kind of collect visual culture, that would be a very daunting task. But if you say, you know what, we treat visual culture in respect to the question of what is Hong Kong, then it gets very specific.
My question is on, does an institution need to own a collection? If you curate a show and you document it well, do you still need that artwork to possess that artwork? And Kieran, I would ask basically, like you mentioned the 3D gun, and you mentioned the fact that you wanted to own it in order to have the conversation in your building. So my question is, should you own it? Is it you should own it or not?
Yes, but you can imagine that it's a really good question. You're not the first very smart person who said, what's the point in owning this thing, which by definition is about its kind of mutual ownership by everyone. Don't really know the answer, is the truth. I think one sort of slightly banal answer is that in the case of the gun, it might feel like it's ubiquitous. Those 100,000 people that downloaded it may all print it out, and there may be 100,000 guns in the world or more. But my instinct is that they won't have the materials scientists, the conservators, the professional expertise needed to keep that thing for 100 years safe, so that when somebody in 100 years gets interested in this moment of manufacturing that we're in right now this year and wants to see the evidence of it, I suspect the only one left will be in places like the V&A. And that's kind of important, and I'm only aware of that having begun work quite recently in an institution that's 150 years old that has indeed kept things that might have looked disposable safe for that kind of length of time, and now people study them and exhibit them. So yeah, maybe, but maybe Lydia, I mean, you have an institution that doesn't have any things, which must be nice.
Well, in the short term, it is kind of takes some of the burden away from you of having to look after an object and think about its kind of eternal history. I do think there are ways to test ideas about contemporary objects and look at them in the short term, perhaps through a display or some sort of pedagogical or interpretive exercise. But ultimately, I do, to some degree, agree with what Kieran just said, that in the long term, the gun is probably going to evolve and change over time, and if you want to go back to the point and be able to talk about the moment, this first became a kind of big issue. It's hard to do that when there's nothing left from that original moment.
Were there any other questions that anybody wanted to ask from the audience? No? King, you haven't said anything. You want to comment on anything about collecting? Because you did have some... Well, we should wrap up, but I would like you to be able to comment maybe on that.
In the spirit of democracy, I think everything is worth collecting. Only that you don't have the resources to do so, so you just pick things by random or by your own interest. And I'm sure at a personal level, it's like this. At the institutional level, of course, you have this acquisition policy document that thick, but each institution started to rationalize this kind of personal preference, I would think, or national preference or whatever institutional preference. So I think this kind of randomness is essential. So I would do my own collection, you would do yours, and you would do yours. Only if you have the gut to justify it and you have the energy and resources to document it as if this is really serious to you. I think this is the lesson I learned from my projects, because I could not even decide whether I document that craftsman as to this one. So ultimately, it was a kind of like random relation, I think, because this craftsman is more friendly than that one, so I do work with him or her more easily than the other one. So to me, it's quite random, I mean, ultimately.
Well, let's hope the M+ isn't entirely random. We have one question here. I think this might be the last one because we're
I think it's a
few
really
minutes
quick
past.
one. Just want to clarify, Kieran, do you actually archive the process of the template of the guns? Because that's related to the question, is it archive really about artifacts only? Because V&A is really famous for artifacts, right?
Yeah, I mean, right, so the V&A not only has all these millions of things, but also has millions of pages of writing about those things in, like, basements. And we have this infrastructure called the registered file, and they're these, like, yellow cardboard files, and they sit in a pile on your desk, and you're supposed to fill them with everything to do with that object. You print out every email, you have every bill, you have every license. I mean, I've never been in a place that's so self-conscious about its own activity. And no doubt, it's my first museum, so maybe every museum is like this. And I'm sure every museum is like this to a certain extent. But, you know, the self-consciousness of the museum, I think you have to draw a line. I think the V&A is extraordinary in that regard. But in a story like that one, not every email is a museum object. It would be ridiculous for the emails to be a museum object, but they're an essential part of the story. And if you came to the V&A as a member of the public, you can say, I want to see the file on the gun. It will be brought to you. You can look at it. You can look at the correspondence. And so that's part of the thing, yeah.
On that note, I think we're a little bit out of time. If there are other questions, maybe people can have a chance to speak individually to some of our speakers. So I'd like to thank the audience, and I'd like to thank our speakers for making their presentations and being here and being available for questions and for all their contributions over the weekend as well. And thanks to everybody, and look forward to the next M+ Matters coming soon. We don't know exactly yet, probably in the spring. We'll let you all know. So thank you.